Hey, small group, it's Ron, and I want to start off by saying Happy Mother's Day to all the moms of our group. Hope you found a way to share it with your kids today. As far as announcements for the group go, there's nothing too new. Lisa and I have seen Sandy and Phil walking down the street, so I assume that means Sandy's feeling some better. And I know Gina had Mallory graduate since last time we had a video small group. And we got word that Eli is getting orders to be deployed domestically. Could be for up to a year. So we're waiting to hear on that. So that's just a waiting game. We knew it was possible when he signed up to be part of the military. Well, we're going to go ahead and look at our second and last installment of Providence. Just to remind you of a few things we've discussed over the last week, or no, last month. First of all, we spent a couple weeks on immutability. That said God cannot change because that would mean he would either be lacking and fix that problem, or he was perfect and something happened and he became less. So he doesn't change because perfection is static. Then we talked about providence, and providence is a pretty complicated issue. The most common way to think of it, probably the simplest, is God governs his creation. Whatever happens in his creation is something that God either caused or at least permitted. And so we're going to look at James chapter 4, verse 13. And there's a lot of places you can look in the Bible and see providence. A few of those would be, for instance, when Ahab, the evil king, was killed by a quote-unquote stray arrow that was fired, God had directed that arrow to find that one chink in the back of the king's armor that would, of course, cost him his life. It says the archer just shot it upward, kind of throwing it up in the air to see where it landed, but God directed it to the back of King Ahab. And then we know the more common ones, like God knows the number of hairs on our head, or that not a sparrow drops without him being aware. All those are statements of providence. And in James chapter 4 here, verse 13, it says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What's your life? For you are mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All who do such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." And so you'll see there where James, the half-brother of the Lord, was saying we ought to make plans, but it's really up to God to see if they're followed through on. So in ancient times, the theologians and preachers who came along after the apostles died, guys like Irenaeus and Clement and Lactantius, they talked about providence commonly, except, as in common, they had some shortcut words. For instance, they would say master of the universe. That meant that God ruled all that he's made. And then they also said ruler of the world. Or when I got saved in the 80s, a common phrase was, God sits upon his throne, which is what providence basically is. Now, providence is easy and even pretty palatable in most areas of life. God providentially keeps the planets in their orbit around our sun. God providentially works among the plants and the animals. And God uses the laws he's put in place to rule a lot of this. I'm not sure he's telling every ball that falls up, it falls down after you've thrown it up. If he orders the gravity to pull it down, I'm more of the inclination that he designed gravity and he sees it continues to work. But where it becomes complicated at is providence, if it stems from God's eternal decree and that he brings it to pass in time, then it seems like the problem of evil is kind of a sticking point. It's called a theodicy. And a lot of people try to explain it away. We're all great that God is involved with the good things that happen, but where does a good, omnipotent God factor in when bad things happen if he controls everything? And does that make him the author of sin? So I'm going to try to, in a few minutes, kind of give you an answer that I go to. And again, it's something that theologians have consistently written on. And there's different views. Some I think are acceptable and orthodox. Some I think aren't worth the paper they're written on. My view would go to, well, like John Calvin and the Reformers took. They viewed God's providence being rooted in his secret decrees from the foundation of the world. But Calvin was very careful to say to his congregation that it's not really our business. That we can't just surrender and give up and say what will happen. That's fate, that's a pagan idea. He's taught that God had given people opportunities to make decisions. They are to make the best decision they can in light of what Luther called common sense and the scriptures, and that we were responsible to do so. Now, if God in his decree has designed events to happen different than the one we're trying to cause to pass, then that's God's business. But we are responsible to make the best decisions and the best efforts we can, leaving the providence of the subject up to God. So that was Calvin's perspective, which I think is very pastoral, and I think it's very helpful. And then Jonathan Edwards, who's just a great mind in pre-colonial America, he kind of wrestled with the idea, well, if God is in charge of all things, how do you not accuse God of evil when it's obvious evil is in the world? And Jonathan Edwards went to say that God is big enough to permit and use evil to his glory for his purposes, but not be the cause of them. Because God's obviously allowed evil. He planted the tree in the garden. He gave Adam and Eve the moral uprightness by which they could choose. He created the being who would become the devil. And so God has used evil. God's not defeated by evil. God's not weakened by evil. God's not scared by evil. But God has used it. And again, it comes back to God's secret decree as to why he permits it. So providence is, as Irenaeus said 1800 years ago, God is the master of the universe. This is simple in areas of inanimate or really unintelligent creatures, such as the laws of physics or the behavior of animals. But when it comes to people and their choices, it is complicated. And there's no denying it. And that's not a bad thing. But I would just encourage you to follow Calvin's advice. Trust that all things are in God's hands. But we, being finite creatures within time, that don't see to the end from the beginning like Isaiah says God does, that we put forth our best efforts as dictated by Scripture and common sense. Again, happy Mother's Day. Hope to see y'all soon. Bye.